letting me come up here. I appreciate that Bob, Diane, and Lisa invited me. I'll give you a little bit of experience that I've had in the manure safety observation and working with some producers and some commercial applicators in Iowa that fell into place last year, and some work that we've done prior to that. I'm at the University of Iowa, and I work on a couple of different projects there. To give you just a short background, one is called the Iowa FACE program, which is a short name for Fatality Assessment and Control Evaluation. This was a project that over 20 years did investigation of work-related fatalities in our state. And we went on site and did fatality investigations, working with employers and families. And in our state, like John had mentioned earlier, we had a high proportion of ag-related fatalities. Roughly about a third of the work-related fatalities in Iowa are farming fatalities. That got us a lot of experience on learning about what happened and getting details from people and having a lot of input from coworkers, family members on why these happen. And so we developed prevention messages from them. I also work with the Great Plains Center, which is a regional federally funded center that covers about Iowa and the surrounding states. Scott Heiberger, who is over here at the camera, who you might have noticed earlier, works with another ag center, which is based out of the University of Minnesota, but Scott also works at the National Farm Medicine Center in Marshfield. We partner on a project that's just getting off the ground right now called Telling the Story, and that's how we got introduced to Bob, Diane, Lisa, learning about Mike's fatality, because the Biadasz family is going to be helping us and working with us on doing some personal story interviews that we're going to pair up with prevention messages, and hopefully you'll be seeing some of these on our websites and in ag media and social media. So we're real interested in learning people's stories, using those stories, because I think it's a lot more interesting to hear your stories and learn about them firsthand than it is to sometimes read a real dry report that I might be able to write and have written in the past. So that's kind of how we got here and have been associated with working with the Biadasz family and the University of Wisconsin Extension so far. So let me give you a little bit of background. It's probably hard to read in the very back of this, but we've been looking at fatalities related to all kinds of ag work, but a lot related to manure storage and manure handling for years. When I started as a grad student in the 80s, the very first thing that I had to do was to go to South Dakota and Nebraska and interview families that had lost family members, multiple fatalities, because people went into a manure pit under hog confinement buildings. One was 3 people in the same family, and another one was a father and son. So this was in the 80s. But this slide gives you a little idea of, just in the very recent few years, some of the events that have happened, and you'll know really well about some of these. But just starting back in 2013, we had a guy who was a young man, entered a manure storage tank. He was out spreading, doing some custom work in northwest Iowa, went into a tank to investigate a clog or some sort of a malfunction, and was knocked out immediately and died from that. Jeremy Schulte. Up here in your area, you are aware of that same year in 2015, Rodney and Jeremy Seibel, who one went into a manure pit and his son tried to rescue him. Both were overcome and died. Just that very same month in Iowa, we lost a father and son in a very similar situation when a son went into a manure pit, and I'll show you a little bit more about that. A father tried to rescue him. Both died. This was also at a hog confinement building. We had a case in Ohio where a worker was on top of a tanker, not even inside of it, but the gas came up through the top and knocked him out, and he was fatally injured. In South Dakota in 2016, a dairy farmer was trying to rescue his brother who had gone down into a manure pit. His brother survived, but Lonnie Martin Moss died, age 58. And then Mike's fatality in August of last year, working outdoors. And as John said, this was the first time that we had really seen something that resulted in a fatality outside. It was not in a manure pit. It wasn't in a confined space, but it was in the open air, and that was something brand new, at least to us, resulting in a fatality. We had heard about children in Pennsylvania that had been knocked out that were riding their bikes around an open lagoon who were exposed to hydrogen sulfide but survived a few years ago. Mike's fatality was the first time we were aware that this could happen in the wide open space outside. And then the month after that, teenager Jonas Hoover, who died after he went into a spreader tank here in Wisconsin. I'm sure some of you are quite familiar with that case too. I don't know all the details, and I bet that you probably know more about that than I do, but the news accounts had mentioned that he had gone in possibly to do some maintenance or address a malfunction. Mike is nodding yes, correct to that. And then just to mention that these are not always, the manure storage facilities and manure transfer activities aren't always about manure gases, but we had just a couple months ago, a man in Minnesota died when he was running a skid loader and broke through the ice of a manure lagoon, and he died as a result of that. And then also in February, a man who was working at a dairy in Canada fell into an opening at a manure pit and died. And I'll show you some slides of that. So just in context, my background is a lot more familiar with manure storage pits that are underneath buildings than lagoons. So I'm not going to claim that I've got a lot of expertise in the lagoons. I'm kind of curious if you would raise a show of hands on how many of you have deep pits under buildings. A few. And how many have open lagoon? More. Okay. All right, so most of my talk will be related to the deep pit storage because that's just what I'm familiar with, and we've worked with people in Iowa who have had problems related to this. But this was a man in northwest Iowa. You've got a picture of him here. He was working, he had a coworker, he went into this manure storage tank when he was spreading. It was in the fall a few years ago. The person who was working with him heard a thud just within seconds of Jeremy going in there. The person who was working with them thought about going in and was overcome by gas and didn't go, but firefighters came and it was futile. He had already died, and they didn't do a rescue. It was a recovery of this young man. The one that was, you're more familiar with this, the Seibel family, both fatalities. This is an example of what a scenario is often in these cases is something falls into a pit and somebody goes down to get it and is overcome with this gas. And I think I'm not sure if we mentioned this earlier in the morning, but hydrogen sulfide, the most toxic of these gases, is heavier than air. So if there's not a lot of wind distribution, it wants to settle. It's heavy, it will settle in low-lying places. And that's why these pits are especially dangerous, or low areas are, because if there's not a lot of air movement, that's where it's going to be. Other gases are lighter than air and will go higher up, like methane is lighter than air, will go higher. But hydrogen sulfide is a low-lying gas. So you should know that lower spaces, you've got higher risk or greater risk of being in those dangerous concentrations. This is the father and son who died in north central Iowa a few years ago. They were working on a pump and a piece of equipment fell into the pit. Austin, the younger one, the son, entered the pit, was overcome by hydrogen sulfide gas, and his dad, noting that, went down to try to rescue him. He had made it partway up the ladder out of the pit, and he also succumbed, so both of those fellas died. And this is a really tragic outcome because in talking to people who have been involved with these fatalities, they say the hardest thing there is to do is to not attempt a rescue, because it's in your heart and your mind that you've got to do something to help. And we've talked to people who have been held back from rescuing. It's your impulse, it's the most natural thing to do when it's not evident at that time, because your concern is so much on helping someone that the same environment that took them is also going to be affecting you if you tried to help. And so that's why I think, did you mention it was 70% of confined space fatalities involve multiple victims? Okay, so I want to spend a little bit more time talking about this particular case. This was one of our FACE investigations that I spent time with the family that was involved in this particular case. This event happened in 2005. So it's been 12 years ago this month, actually, almost to the day. But there was a 52-year-old operator. This was a cattle confinement building, a building that the lower picture, the black and white photo shows, was built in 1975. They'd been feeding cattle in this building. It had an 8-foot deep pit. They'd been pumping manure out of it twice a year since 1975, very familiar with it. It had concrete slats that from time to time would break and pieces would fall in. So a couple times of the year, it was routine for them after the pit had been pumped to go down and get those broken slats out and deal with them. So they had experience in going into a pit thinking this was normal, you know, this is what we got to do when we've got our pit empty, we'll get this junk out of here. This family was not aware at all of the gases and the danger of gases inside a pit. On this particular day in April, Dwight, the father, the main operator of the family, they had emptied 5 sections of this pit underneath the building. They had just finished the very last one. He was working with his employee, who was just like their son, basically. He was working with his employee, Justin. They got the building pumped out, and at that time, Dwight said he was going to go down and get a chain that had fallen down into the pit. They had used a chain to secure one of these cattle gates. So he climbed down this vertical pump, went into the pit with a hoe because he was going to try to rake around this. They had about 6 inches of manure remaining. He went down with a hoe to try to rake around, try to get this chain back up, and he collapsed. The guy that was working with him, the 23-year-old, ran to the house. We don't know if he saw this or he heard it or if he came across and didn't see where Dwight was and noticed that Dwight was in the pit, but there's no way to know exactly what happened. But Justin did run to the house and notified Dwight's wife to call 911, ran back, and then he climbed down into this pit also to rescue Dwight, and he also was overcome. One was lying face down, one was lying face up. The wife ran to the scene with a ladder, thinking that she was going to climb down and try to rescue both of them. Her father, who happened to be on the site at the same time because he rode over on an ATV, stopped her from going down, saying, "It'll be you next." You can about imagine the chaotic scenario that was going on. But they fortunately lived about a half-mile away from town. They had called 911, EMTs and first responders arrived, and were able to get both of these men out of the pit. What had happened, as we learned through the investigation and talking to some of the people that were neighbors and that were responders, is one of the people responding went into the pit with an SCBA, an air pack respirator on, started to feel a little bit woozy, and came back. He did not, I was told, have an SCBA on. He had a normal half mask respirator on, like John had shown, just covering your nose. The one that we said does not provide protection against hydrogen sulfide gas. Other firefighters responded and they had SCBAs on. They got these guys out and they were sent to University Hospital and Iowa City, but they both died within a week to 2 weeks later. So this happened 12 years ago in Andover, which is in the east central part of the state, right along, very close to the Mississippi River. So let's fast forward to last year. We learned about Mike's fatality. It was something we were not familiar with and really raised a lot of concerns on how can this happen in the wide open air? We've never seen anything like this. We were more used to these enclosed, confined areas. That set the stage for what happened a couple months later, last October. The very same farm that I had just talked about in Andover, where Dwight Johnson and his hired man, Justin, died, had a bunch of cattle die on October 22nd, a Saturday. This is a picture of their site. They had put up a brand new confinement building in 2012. The Cheryl Johnson and her son were now running this operation, had increased and had been doing custom cattle feeding. And this is a picture of the new building that they had put up, and this is where they lost 23 cattle on October 22nd. Because they'd been involved with this Iowa FACE investigation, we talked about the hazards of the gases. They called the next day. Cheryl called and was extremely alarmed and distraught because they had lost cattle. They knew this time exactly what had happened because they had a building that held over 700 animals. It was separated into pits. They were not able to get animals out when they pumped, and they had never done that before. There wasn't a provision of moving animals to another location. So they had animals in a section. There were 6 different sections of pits, and they were pumping out one. They'd been pumping out all day. And what happened on that particular day was they'd pumped during the day. They took a break around late afternoon to do their cattle feeding chores. And then after they got those done, one of their employers went back to the pit, and this shows exactly what it looked like. They had a tractor that was running a vertical pit, and they were pumping into a tanker. They were taking manure to the field. So he went back. It was after 5 o'clock. He started the agitator on the pump and walked down to try to find a 2x4 because he wanted to get a probe to stick down between the slats just to kind of see how sticky, how solid, how well this was mixing up, and to see what the depth was. As he was walking away, and it was fortunate that he was walking away, he heard this banging noise and looked back, and he was seeing animals just falling to the ground, being knocked out. And he had the presence of mind, and because he knew of the hazard of this gas, because of what they had experienced years earlier, he had the presence of mind to, 1, shut off the agitator, which would stop the stirring and propulsion of the manure that was generating this gas and getting it to come up through the slats. He called his boss, and he then went into town and got in self-contained breathing apparatus and air pack. They brought portable fans down that they put on the animals that were in the pen, and this guy went into the pen, and with his SCBA, his air pack on, he was safely using the right respiratory protection, got animals out. So of 31 animals that were down, they lost 23. They got the rest of them out of there. One of them was blind that day but recovered within a day later. Their veterinarian came on site and did toxicology tests. They submitted tissues to a veterinary lab, and it was confirmed that it was hydrogen sulfide poisoning, hydrogen sulfide exposure that got these animals. So the day after I heard from Cheryl, who called me about this, we went on site and we took some monitors because they had several things that they had to deal with. One, they had 20-some animals that they had to take care of. They also had a completely full pit that they had to deal with. They needed to get this pit pumped. They were having rain. They were worried about it going out and, having an environmental issue if they weren't able to get these pits pumped. So we spent about a week on site with a variety of monitors that we have, and we were measuring concentrations right at this area. And I've got some pictures. If I point up here, these are monitors that I brought with me. We had a couple of them set up. They're the 4-gas monitors that we were talking about, and I think they're some of the ones that Jim sells, a little earlier version. We also had we had 3 different types of 4-gas monitors, and we also had single-gas hydrogen sulfide monitors on people because we were really concerned about if this knocked out cattle, we've got to be protecting people who are working around here because they knew all too well what the worst case scenario could be. So these are just a few pictures of what we saw and a really brief summary of the results that we measured. We saw several things. One is it was completely unpredictable. We couldn't detect or predict what was going on. There was a bit of a breeze then. It was, I think, around, did I say what? I don't think I said what the environmental conditions were on the day that this happened. But we were on site. We had monitors that were data logging so we could see what the peaks were, and it was recording information. We saw levels right where these yellow meters are up to 400 parts per million on the days that I was there with these monitors. We were all wearing single gas monitors. We had some other monitors with us too. They were going off and alarming all the time almost. It would be very unpredictable. We'd be standing there, it would be quiet. We would be looking at the monitor results, which would give us the readout, which is really important to see what the parts per million is, not just hear an alarm, but for us, we wanted to know what are the levels. So we saw levels 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 2, and within seconds, we would see 20, 30, 40. We were reading this aloud almost to each other, like 20, 30, 40, 80, 120, it could change that fast. And that's the point I want to make really clear, is to emphasize what had been mentioned before. Very bursts is what we called it. It would be like a burst of gas and then die down again. And it was interesting and it was scary at the same time to see this happening without any warning, any way to know what we could predict. There was a bit of a wind. We were on site several days. Jason, who was the son and another operator, did use one of the probes like was passed around earlier and dropped the probe down underneath the slats near the surface of the manure, and his quote was, "The monitor went nuts, Steph," when they started the agitator. There was some interest in folks that were there, like, can we add anything to this to try to cut the hydrogen sulfide release or cut the amount of hydrogen sulfide that is in the manure. And Iowa State Extension manure specialist, I would say probably our counterpart to Becky here, a guy named Dan Anderson, was on site with us too, measuring, and he had gotten some recommendations from the University of Minnesota saying you could add an oxidizing agent. Some research shows that that can work in certain scenarios. So on one of the days, they did add a 55-gallon drum of 30% hydrogen peroxide to this pit that we were pumping out of, which each pit was about 200,000 gallons. The whole building was 1.2 million gallons divided into 6 sections. So that's what they advised that we add to the mix. And you can see up here, this is the guys put on some PPE so they would not get any splashes or skin contact with us, and they slowly emptied this high concentration of hydrogen peroxide into the pit. The end result didn't really seem to make any difference at all. And so I think the take-home point that we've heard from our extension people is there's no magic solution to add to a pit that's going to make this a safe scenario. And if someone claims that they've got something like that, you'd probably want to see research data that shows that it does. And even if it does, as Becky mentioned earlier, it would cost a whole lot of money to do it. So we're a little bit wary of that being the solution to try to go to. So this slide just is to show you what the symptoms are that people experience. And I can say that we're experiencing these. The first day that I was on site doing this, I was there all day long, drove home, and my eyes were just killing me. And it didn't even dawn on me that that was because of the gas until a couple days later, when I realized. Okay. Do they know what Mike's exposure level was? In his blood. Okay, that's.
Blood level, the minimum is 4.6, the max being toxic is 13, his is 9.2, twice the minimum.
Okay, so Bob just mentioned that Mike's toxicology testing after an autopsy was performed confirmed that he was exposed at twice the lethal level. That was a blood test. This slide is showing air concentrations in parts per million. But what we can do to match these two things together is assume that Mike was exposed at concentrations probably in the 1,000 parts or more, probably more. And we've seen through the years, not me personally, but researchers have been able to show and measure in certain scenarios that you can have outdoor concentrations that might be 1 part per million, 2 parts per million. And when agitation starts, depending on where this agitation nozzle is, especially if it's close to the surface, basically you're propelling gas up into the air. I mean, if the nozzle is way below, it's not going to push and shoot that gas up into the air. But if you've got a nozzle that's very close to the surface of the manure, you're blasting it into the air, and the concentrations can increase by more than 1,000 times just within seconds. That's what you need to keep in mind. So Mike, I think people mostly would be able to agree that what Mike was exposed to and what the cattle were exposed to that were nearby was in the range of 1,000 parts per million or more. And we don't know what that top level could be. But it's almost like you don't need to know. You get up into the range of 500, 700 and more, there's going to be a bad outcome probably. We mentioned even below that, 100 parts per million is called immediately dangerous to life and health, and that's because there's no good warning properties for us at that point. Becky had mentioned that that's where your sense of smell becomes paralyzed. There's nothing to tell you that there's a warning point and to distinguish like things are getting more and more dangerous. That's where a monitor that's calibrated and working properly can help you. So I'll admit we were around concentrations that were up to 400 parts per million, but we were wearing monitors, and when we saw concentrations rising and we were looking at these outputs on the monitors, we were all getting the hell out of there. I mean, we were moving down the hill, getting away, and when the good thing about the monitors we're wearing is when they stop beeping is when the concentrations are going down again. And up at that site where we were working, which is right along here in these photos, you know, it wouldn't take long for those concentrations to settle right back down to less than 10 parts per million again. So we were constantly watching and vigilant about what was going on. But you see in the lower picture, these guys are smiling, which was not, nobody was smiling those first couple days because everybody was worried sick about what was going on. Were they going to lose more cattle? Were they in danger? We were up there, it was, you know, I think for a week or a little bit more. And it was a relief for these guys to see that monitors were working correctly. They were giving an audible, a loud beeping alarm. They would give a flashing light alarm, and they were buzzing. And what we also learned was those monitors that people were wearing, and they had a couple different varieties of single gas monitors, a couple different manufacturer models. They were all working together in concert. So we didn't have like this monitor went off and then 30 seconds later another one did. The ones that I took up that were in the thousands of dollars that we use at the university for research purposes were beeping and going off at the same time these were. And that was a good sign basically to us. We were glad to see that they were working together and that we didn't have any outliers of what was going on. So what came out of this, you can see this guy over here. This is our Iowa State manure specialist. This is the guy that was hauling that day. This is Jason, who is running the operation. They were able to use, and were really interested in using the monitor outputs to gauge how they were doing their agitation strategy. So when the levels were going up and climbing higher, they used that information to kind of dial back the agitator and not be stirring as rapidly and as aggressively as they were before, because they wanted to keep these levels down. They had cattle that were not in the pit that was being pumped. They did get a way to move them out, but they did have cattle in the adjacent pits. So they were concerned not only with themselves, but with animals that were on either side of this. So they were using these as a way to manage how they could pump and try to keep these levels controlled a bit. So, sorry about that. So what happened as a result of this? This community, when we showed up that first day, we learned that the Johnson family wasn't the only one that had lost cattle in an open confinement building. Their cattle confinement building didn't have walls, this new one, it only had a roof. We got up there and we learned, because they are also custom applicators, that there had been 2 sites in the prior 2 weeks that had lost cattle in Illinois. There was another site in Iowa not too far away that also lost cattle. And then we also learned that there were sites in Wisconsin that had lost cattle during the fall pumping season. So this was all happening within less than a month. And then we had human fatality a couple months prior to that really raised a lot of alarm for a lot of us. And these people were aware of other incidents. And so this family organized a safety meeting that they held in their shop like 4 days after they lost cattle, and just notified people by word of mouth. And they probably had about this many people. It was over 80 folks came, very concerned about what to do, how could we prevent this, what precautions should we take. And it generated a lot of good discussion like what you've had here this morning about management practices and monitors and ventilation and feed ingredients and all those things that factor in to risk. That group is continuing to try to raise awareness and keep each other informed on the levels that they're seeing. I wanted to share some of the take-home messages that they have kind of a committee and a group that's working together. A few things that they're emphasizing. One is planning ahead, not waiting until the day that you need to pump to decide what do we need to have on hand. So a month ahead of time, we're saying, here's some things to consider. One is get signage up, so if you've got visitors that are coming on site or contractors or kids, that you've got these areas well defined and well marked that this is a hazard because there's manure storage on site. And then on the days that you're doing your pumping, you might need to have another sign up that says, we are pumping today, stay out. No access allowed. So you don't have someone inadvertently who doesn't know what you're doing come on site looking for someone or trying to find someone and not realizing that this is a really dangerous situation. Having an emergency action plan is really important because a person, if someone gets in danger or is overcome and someone else comes along and finds them, they might not know even how to describe the address of where this is, if they need to call 911 and get someone involved. So if you can have an emergency plan that you've got established already for your family or your coworkers that says, this is what we got to do. We have to call 911. This is our address. So in the moment of when people are distraught and panicked and worried, they know how to call in an emergency. And importantly, in this particular scenario is to have people know how to turn off the agitator, because the agitator for a pump might still be running. And the important thing is to get this thing shut off so we're not continuing to generate this gas and push it into the air. Yes?
I know you say shut off. Myself, I'd leave it run, and you should leave the area. Wait for rescue to come in with air masks to shut that off. Because if you're so close to agitating, the gas got to be everywhere agitating. Right?
I think that's a good point. So what he said, I probably should have given you, do you want to say that again? I'll try to paraphrase what you said. This fella said, I think you should leave the agitator running because to shut off the agitator, you might be going near the source of where this gas is. And that's a good point. John?
I have another point based on your. So you mentioned emergency procedure plan. One thing that you could do, or I found in other industries, is they actually call the local fire department before they begin the work and let them know they'll be doing that type of work that day. That puts them on notice and says, hey, if you get a call from our farm, you probably need to send this rig, because not all the trucks have the same equipment on it to do that type of rescue. So it's just something to consider, especially if you're going into the pit. You need retrieval equipment, specialized retrieval equipment, harnesses, retrieval lanyards, and that sort of thing, tripods, a lot of stuff that's sold in the general industry. Not every volunteer department has that type of equipment,
Right.
nor do they have enough money to have it on every single truck. So if you call them in advance and say, hey, on these days we'll be doing pumping, if you get a call from our farm, you probably need to have this type of equipment ready.
That's a good point. I think we're going to have a slide to kind of mention that again, but another part of our telling the story activity, I interviewed a guy, the only person I've known that has explained this, an Iowa guy who was exposed to hydrogen sulfide in 2010, and he survived it. What his particular scenario, to try to squeeze it down to a very short time frame, is he and another guy were running a tractor, applying manure at a hog facility that had been pumping out. So they were pumping, they would go fill a tank and take turns hauling out to the field. He was with his wife, who had brought out supper to him for a tractor date because they were working so hard and spending a lot of time in the field. So he and his wife were out in the tractor spreading, took a break to eat their supper. He went into the building that they were pumping out of because he wanted to use the restroom. So the tractor was running the pump and the agitator because they were trying to get the tank filled, and he was up in the cab with his wife, but he took a break, went into the restroom, and he passed out from hydrogen sulfide. She told her story. She said, I didn't know how to turn this thing off. A few minutes had passed, too many minutes had passed, and I wondered why he wasn't coming back out, and I looked in the door, and I could see down the aisle his feet like this. So he was lying down. He had been overcome. And she said, I didn't know how to shut this off. So she had to call for help. But in that case, the agitator and the protractor wasn't near the source. That's a case where turning the agitator off would be desirable, because he's in there where this is being stirred and stirred underneath him. She was not near the source. So that was, what I was thinking of when you mentioned your point about, it depends where the source is. If this does put you in more danger to go closer to where this is being emitted, that's a problem. But if you can do it without getting closer to the source, you want to shut it off, because you're going to stop generation if you've got somebody who's, passed out or knocked down in the immediate area. But I think you raise a really good point
But
on,
it's still, the air movement changes, and it's still gonna come towards you anyhow. It gets so plugged up, it's gotta go somewhere.
yeah,
Yeah, so when the person was down, the proper thing is that she didn't go in there after,
yeah,
because that would've been the same thing as the rest.
yeah. Anybody else want to weigh in on that debate? Let's see. Go up ahead. Oh, I'm going the wrong direction. I'm sorry. Forward. Okay, planning ahead. The other thing that was apparent to me at this particular site, it's a little different than the lagoon sites, but these folks have to take out a section of slat flooring. In this case, it's 4 feet by 12 feet that they lift out and remove so they can put a pump in. I was scared to death about being around here, because I was scared I would fall in by being around here. At this particular pump, the green one, to rotate the nozzles, the operator had to stand right about here and crank this crank to get the nozzles to direct to different circumference, or like 12 o'clock to 12 o'clock on a dial around here. So he is leaning and standing right over this, and I was very scared about falling in, knowing that no one could get this person out, or any of us out, if somebody fell into 10-foot deep manure. I mean, you're drowning, there's an agitator running. And this, I don't know the scenario of what happened in Canada, but a man did fall into a pit opening that was not secured with a gate or a grate or some sort of covering to prevent this. So another one of the recommendations that this group came up with is we've got to get some way to cordon this off to prevent the danger if somebody trips or slips. It's a slippery surface, with your boots on. If you fall in the wrong direction, that's a safety hazard that you might fall because of manure gas. You might, become dizzy or woozy or something like that. So this opening should be secured to prevent falling in. The one on the right is a smaller opening that's another neighbor of theirs, not quite as big as the original one that we were working with, which is on the left-hand side. The other thing, then we'll get to the gas monitor issue. These folks, there's probably a group of 2 dozen to 2.5 dozen locally that are custom applicators and cattle confinement operators. They got monitors, and they got several different ones. We have an industrial supply safety company that's nearby them, so they did have a local resource for calibrating this, for support on how to use them. They rented the more expensive one that's up in the top corner. They rented it for a month because they knew they'd have to be pumping several buildings and locations. They also purchased a single gas monitor, the one that's the orange one up on the top. There are different levels of these. The least expensive is one that will read out how many months of service life is left. And some of these guys had that. The next grade up is one that reads how many months of service life is left, but it also tells how many parts per million the sensor is reading. Now these guys found that to be much more useful and helpful to them, because if you have an alarm going off, you only know that it's above 15. You don't know if it's 18 or if it's 99 or if it's 120. But these guys, and we sure agreed, felt that it's important to know what's happening. If you look at your monitor and you see, okay, we went from 15 and now we're reading 80, that's a more dire circumstance, then our levels are kind of hanging here right at about 16 and not much is happening. So they felt that having a parts per million readout was really important. I agree with that. This is one of the guys that was wearing it. He said, I had no idea that really, you know, this is a lot more dangerous than we realized, and because you can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't predict it, the air currents change, there's no way to predict anything clearly with this other than the fact that it's unpredictable. So he felt that using a monitor was a good way to have at least some preview of changing conditions, and then using that information along with trying to do some agitation strategy and planning to plan this to make it as safe as possible. The things that they felt were important based on the monitors that they were renting and using were, one, that real-time concentration readout in parts per million, so they could see what the level was to distinguish between a low alarm versus a very high alarm. One, to have it be low maintenance, in other words, not something you've got to mess around with a lot. They preferred some that had a 24 or 36-month service life that they didn't have to do much to at all. Just when the end of life was done, you throw it away. It's a low-cost investment. They felt that they wanted to be able to download the alarm events, and they're keeping track of that because they're trying to see, are there certain pens, certain rations that we're getting higher levels on that can help us measure kind of the sulfur input and the sulfur content of our manure. They like the ones that had a sleep or a hibernate mode so that if there were months where they weren't using it, they could extend the 24 or 36-month service life. It's important to calibrate and bump test them, and just like has been said by Becky and John and Jim earlier, having a monitor that is drifting with its sensor, not quite accurate, doesn't do you too much good. So having either a local supply company or having the equipment yourself that you can calibrate is your only insurance policy to help you know that your monitor is performing the way you want it to. It's like a smoke detector. You know, if you have a smoke detector in your house that you never change out and the sensor's gone, what is the point? You know, you've kind of defeated the purpose. And then they talked about renting versus buying, and they felt that renting for a month, some of those more higher cost monitors, like a 4-gas monitor that would data log, they liked that option. And they did do that, like rent a month at a time. And then they could turn it back into their industrial supply equipment company, not worry about the calibration. The calibration was done once every 30 days or so. They felt like that was practical for them. Okay, this is a very busy slide that just kind of recaps some of the pumping and transfer points that were mentioned through our extension manure specialist and our extension livestock engineers, which are remove animals if possible before you start. If you can schedule this with maximum ventilation, our folks have recommended to shoot for at least a 7 to 10 mile an hour crosswind. If you can get it for an outdoor, more is better. Keeping in mind that if you've got animals that are kind of blocking the wind, you don't really have 7 or 10 miles per hour right next to you or where those animals are, that structures or even animals themselves can kind of prevent the dispersion or distribution of gases that are coming up. Work with a partner and have your partner know where you are and communicate with your partner. Working alone is an increased risk for not being found in time, and we know this for Mike's case. He was working alone. He had no idea that this was going to be a dangerous scenario. But having and communicating with a partner is really important. Wearing a personal gas monitor, using an area monitor near the pump to help you kind of gauge your agitation strategy, knowing when to slow it down, speed it up, or even take a break if you have to, if the wind conditions are dying down. Our folks are saying with the deep pits, don't even start agitating until you've got at least about a 2-foot headspace below the slats, because since hydrogen sulfide is heavy, that will allow a space for the gas to accumulate if you agitate slowly, so it's not going to immediately go up into the breathing zone of animals and people. And importantly, keeping the jets below the surface, because if you've got jets for your pump that are shooting manure out, you're blowing gases too. So you want to keep those submerged if possible, and if the manure surface is down by that bottom jet within 6 inches, you're going to see high levels, and we did see that because we did take our monitors around and experiment with this. I probably shouldn't admit this, but we did confirm that that does happen. You know, you get your agitator near the manure surface and you're going to see extremely high concentrations fast. Try not to get down on the floor level or near the surface yourself because of its being heavier than air. And don't climb on top of a tank to look in. If you're one of the commercial applicators, you climb up a ladder. If your float that you've got isn't, you know, working right and showing you how much manure is in that tank, don't climb up on the ladder and look over and in, because you are going to be, you know, right in an area where you can be exposed to that gas. Okay, last couple things is, one, these respirators won't protect against hydrogen sulfide, period. One of the case that I interviewed folks with when I was in grad school, these family members had gone in to clean out a pit and they were wearing this kind of respirator and they had no idea that that was not going to protect against hydrogen sulfide. They didn't even know what the gas was. There wasn't that much information about this at the time. The only thing that works is a self-contained breathing apparatus, but you have to be fitted and you have to be trained. And then I will mention kind of a commercial, I guess, for other folks. We've got a really good resource in the Midwest called the National Education Center for Agricultural Safety. It's at Piasta, Iowa, which is near Dubuque by Galena, the northeast part of the state. They have grants to conduct training, and they do conduct training all over the country. They've developed training grants for producers, farmers, firefighters, EMTs, first responders on how to do confined space rescue, how to do confined space entry using lanyards and atmosphere testing equipment and harnesses, how to be a rescuer using tripods like Jim mentioned. So you've got a winch that can lift out somebody if they are unable to respond and help themselves out of a situation. So if you're a local firefighting group or volunteer firefighters, you might want to take note of this because they're a great resource. They've trained on grain bin entry, manure pit rescue, manure pit entry. With this, I'm going to kind of pass this over to the monitor people. This is just slides that we've used before, showing some of the ones that we've used on sites and talking about bump checks, but I think that Carmen and Jim are going to discuss this. Okay. All right, so do you have any questions or comments? I think if you have stories, you can talk to Scott and I if you've got experiences, but if you've got questions about the hazard, these fatalities that have happened, safe procedures, unsafe procedures, or anything that we've mentioned, please call out. All right, thank you.